Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the cottage kitchen at the Elliott Homestead. We have a lot of work to do today, so I wanted to sneak away into the kitchen to get some food prepped for dinner so that we can freely work outside without worrying about what we're going to eat. Part of this time of year is figuring out what we're going to grow again in the garden. That's the work that we have ahead of us today, and it's a great time for me to sort of reflect on what we've grown. Have we grown too much of one thing, not enough of another thing? So onions did really well last year, and I still have 4 lugs of them in my root cellar, which means we still have a lot of onions to go through. Now, we also still have a good period of time before we're going to harvest those onions again. These ones came out of the ground in August of last year, so they're pretty old now at this point. You can see that some of them have bolted, which is what this looks like. So instead of holding their energy in the bulb, they've put their energy into sprouting again. So this is no good, and we're going to have to compost that. Some of them are just a little bit past their prime, and we can still sort of maybe grade them up or put them in the food processor and freeze dry them and store them that way. But some of them we're just going to eat fresh because we still have, what month is it? April? We still have between April and August until we harvest fresh onions again. So we're going to make a French onion soup today, use up some of these storage onions, sort of sort through this lug, get rid of the ones that need to be composted, eat the ones that need to be eaten, and then ultimately have a really beautiful soup on the stove for supper later after all the work is done. All right, so the first step is just going to be to sort off the really obvious onions that have bolted. Now, these tops that have grown out here are actually good to eat as green onions, which you can certainly do. And I might do that a bit later, but right now my focus is really on just getting this soup on the stove. You can see, hey, I mean, that's really all that's bolted. That's pretty good. So I keep 2 major varieties of onion. This is a red carpet onion, which is a really great storage onion. And this is a Patterson storage onion, which is also a really great storage onion. And so I'm going to use a combination of both of these onions in my soup. French onion soup is really traditionally made with purple onions, but the Patterson ones are really sweet and really good as well. My kids love this soup, so I'm going to make sure we have lots of onions in it. Now, when I'm trying to figure out how many onions to grow for the year, I try to account for at least 2 onions per day in our kitchen. So whether we're sauteing that up for a soup, or to put with our morning eggs. I mean, really, you use onions in so many ways, at least we do. So I try to calculate growing anywhere between 700 and 1,000 onions a year, which sounds like a ton. But when you go to make a soup like this and you're using maybe 10 onions, you go through them pretty quickly. Because I'm gonna be chopping up so many onions and I don't want this soup to be too fussy, I'm just gonna use my food processor to chop these onions up for me. So I'm just gonna take the skins off. Now, sometimes when you have onions that are old like this, they can be gross in the middle. And if I get one of those, I just toss it and compost it. But for the most part, they still look really great. This is something that you'll really commonly see in onions that have stored for a while, which is just the core is starting to sprout. It tastes fine. We're going to be chopping it up anyway, so it's not a big deal. So we'll just set that aside too. My onions are going to slice up really quick because I'm going to be using the food processor for it. So I'm going to go ahead and get some butter melting. So I have found the trick to a really rich onion soup is to give the onions time to cook down. That's why I'm going to go ahead and start this ahead of time, because the longer it sort of cooks down, the more flavorful it gets. So I'm going to start with a good chunk of butter, which is just going to kind of help those onions to saute evenly and to cook down. I'm going to use kind of a medium heat on this because I do want those onions to get going. I don't want them to get too soft and too mushy and just dissolve. I want to get some heat underneath them and get them to colorize a little bit. And then we'll let it slow cook in the broth on the simmer plate. All right, so here we go. So if you follow along on our channel, you know that we recently added a larger Lacanche range here on this wall. This wasn't originally where the stove was in the kitchen, but the way that it works is because you get to configure your burners however you like. I inevitably use this burner the most because this is where my work surface is. So I chose my BTUs of the burners accordingly so that this would be the one that I would go to the most because it just naturally fits into where I work. Now, I know this looks like a ton of onions, but it will really cook down. I have the heat kind of cranked under this burner to get those onions started. Even though I've got the heat on fairly high underneath these onions, it's gonna take them a few minutes to kind of cook down and start to soften. So I'm gonna go ahead and season them now with some salt, which is also gonna start to help them sort of wilt down a bit. And chili flakes, which I put in absolutely everything. Adds a little bit of heat, a little bit of backbone. A little bit of garlic. This is also from last year's harvest. And because it started to go bad, we just freeze-dried it. And now it works great. And it's actually really convenient to not have to peel garlic all the time. We'll add some black pepper. It might technically be spring, but it's still pretty darn cold here, so I'm gonna look forward to having this soup when we come in from working outside. Typically, French onion soup is made with beef broth, which I don't have on hand. So our kitchen is all about using up what you have, and so today that's chicken stock. I'm gonna counter the lightness of chicken stock compared to beef broth by adding in some Worcestershire. I know people are gonna make fun of how I say this. Worcestershire. How do you say it?
Worcestershire sauce?
Worcestershire.
Worcestershire sauce?
So I'm going to counter the lightness of the chicken stock that I have on hand by adding in some Worcestershire sauce. That's not how you say it.
Worcestershire
Sauce. It kind of has some depth to it. So what we lack in beef broth, which is what's traditionally used, we're going to make up for with a little bit of that dark Worcestershire sauce. Nailed it. You can see how much the onions start to cook down. And if you peek in here, you can see that our burner has gotten nice and hot and gotten a little bit of char on the bottom of the pan, which is perfect. That's going to give us color. It's also going to give us flavor. It's got a really beautiful dark onion butter deliciousness going on right now. All of my burners are fairly strong, and I chose them to be like that because I want to be able to use them for as many things as possible. But sometimes when you need to bump something down to a lower heat, because it's gonna sit on the stove all day, that's where this beast comes in. This is a simmer plate. I'm gonna put this on my back two burners, which have lower BTU, so that once I add everything I need to this soup, it can hang out on the simmer plate while I go outside and work. So this thing's pretty cool. It literally just nestles right over the top, and then I can turn the back burner on, which will just keep this nice and gently warm for my soup. All right, these are softened and cooked down now. So I'm gonna pour in my broth. Here we go. Don't make a mess, Shaye. Oh. Look at that. Oh, I love this dish so much. Okay, and in goes our, however you say it. Now I'm gonna let this hang out while we're outside, and then when I come back in, I'll adjust the seasoning as needed. I'm also gonna see if I can find any thyme yet coming up in the garden, because I would really love to add some fresh thyme to this as well. In the meanwhile, I'm gonna move this over to my simmer plate where it can just hang out for the next few hours while we go outside. Because we're about 4 weeks out now from the last frost. We have a lot of planting to do. Some of my onions and other cold weather crops like cabbages, or these are some really beautiful sweet pea flowers, some lettuces and those sorts of things. Those were started a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to show you how I start those. I also have some that need to be directly planted out into the garden today. So I'm going to grow some scallions, or also known as green onions or bunching onions. Those I just plant directly into the ground. It's not a crop that really matters to me. I'm not taking it to market. It doesn't need to be done at any certain time. So I just kind of save myself the work and put it directly into the ground. Some crops I like to be a little bit more precise with and get a little bit of growth on them in the greenhouse before they go out. It makes managing the gardens a little bit easier, knowing what to plant, how far apart to plant them. So that's why I have some cabbages, broccolis, and those sorts of things started in here. Okay, so to grow 1,000 onions, that's not a small task. Some of them I grow are fresh onions, which means they're not meant for storage. They have a higher sugar content and they're meant to be eaten fresh and not stored. That's like this one. This is a Walla Walla onion. I have a bunch of family actually who still lives in Walla Walla. This was named after Walla Walla, Washington, where this onion was developed. It's a really sweet onion, really delicious, great in salsa, not great for storage. So these ones I just sow in little 4x4 containers like this. And then, these are large enough now to transplant out into the garden. That's not on the list today. But for my storage onions, the ones I'm growing 1,000 of, those need to be a little bit easier to take out into the garden, which is why I grow them in these great seed trays here. So they haven't sprouted yet. I just planted them last week. But each of these cells has 5 onion seeds in it. And when they come up, they'll come up all bunched together. Now, what's neat about this is that you can take the whole cell out, transplant it to the garden, and just let those onions grow in the little cluster together. I call it cluster planting, but there's different names for it. What that means is instead of transplanting little onion hairs, as I like to call them, which are small and tricky to manage, I can instead just plant a cell, which is much easier to manage because I'm just planting one plug that has 5 onions in it instead of 5 individual plants. This has not affected the size of the onions at all. They just sort of grow out and against each other, and that's been great. So that's how I'm able to, what looks like 1,000 onions is really just, a couple of trays like this. So it's really not too much work. But today I have some other crops to plant. So let's go through our seeds and see what we need to get in the ground. So for the gardeners, sometimes what you grow in your greenhouse and what you directly plant, it just depends on how much work you want to have. This year I'm dialing things back a bit. I'm taking things a bit easier on myself. Got nothing to prove. I just want to grow this delicious food because I enjoy it. And so a lot of things that I could start now in the greenhouse, I'm just going to direct sow when it's time. But there are some things that like it cold. So I have those bunching onions that I was telling you about. I've got dill. I'm going to start some basil inside. Cilantro can go out into the garden. Basically, the thing about gardening is you get to make the choices. You get to decide what you want to sow inside, what you want to do outside. There's a lot of freedom here. So all of that planting in the greenhouse only took us about 10 minutes, but now we're gonna move out to the beds. We were gone last summer, at the end of summer, beginning of fall, when we went to Sicily. And so a lot of the garden beds we just left completely full of vegetables, so there's a lot of cleanup to do, unfortunately. We do no dig here, which means that instead of tilling our ground, we add fresh compost on top every year. So we're gonna go pull some stuff out of the beds, get that fresh compost on top, and then we'll be able to plant some of our new seeds. After the work outside is done, it's time to head back in and finish up our soup. This is where you get to adjust the seasonings to your taste, but luckily for me, today's soup was right on the money. Now, when we configured our LaCanche range months ago when we ordered it, it was really important to me that it also have a broiler because I love French onion soup. And to get that beautiful melty cheese and charred bread on top, you really need to have a broiler. So the left side of my oven is a gas range, the right side is an electric range with a broiler. Perfect for this soup. So I'm going to assemble the soup in oven-proof dishes, put my bread on top, and broil it until it's nice and melty and crispy on the edges. We've done gardening and we've done cooking on this farm for years without having the right tool. In fact, we often joke about one year when I was out digging trenches to plant radish seeds in with a rock because it was the only tool I had. I feel very grateful to come in from a day in the garden, having had the tools and the seeds that I needed to get the job done, to then come inside and be able to put something so nourishing and so delicious and have the tools that I need to do that as well. None of this is overnight. All of this is a process, whether it's learning to cook or learning to garden or having the right tools on hand. So these small meals and these small moments and these small days in the garden end up feeling like a massive victory.